There are plants that will survive the grasshopper apocalypse, and plants that will be eaten first by the hungry hordes. Welcome back, casual gardeners. I've mentioned Grasshopper 2024 in a couple of my videos. It's something that's happening where I live, and it might be something that's happening where you live too. Have you noticed that some plants seem to be chewed to the ground while others are left relatively untouched? Have you wondered about alternatives to pesticides that you could use in your garden to control grasshoppers? Using the power of the internet, I found answers to those questions and more, and I'm going to share them with you in this video. So let's start with the plants that are definitely grasshopper resistant and the plants that are definitely not. Grasshoppers will eat anything if food becomes scarce. They'll even strip the softer bark tissue off of your trees and start killing trees. So if your grasshoppers have a really dense population or run out of their preferred forage, there's actually nothing you can do. Your whole garden is going to be chewed to pieces. In my garden, I've noticed that grasshoppers like lettuce, but they don't like bolting lettuce. They love kohlrabi, and they've absolutely destroyed my carrots and my onions. There are no carrots or onions in my garden this year, even though I planted a bunch. According to the article from phys.org that I have linked down in the description of the video, grasshoppers prefer to eat leafy greens, corn, cereal crops, beans, carrots, and onions. I've also noticed that even though grasshoppers chew on them, they don't do as much damage to my peppers, or my tomatoes, or my zucchini, or my squash, or melons. They kind of leave those alone. I mean, I can find lots of grasshopper frass, which is the polite term for their poop, and I can see holes in the leaves, but they're still doing great. I also noticed that the grasshoppers didn't really start munching my garlic until the grasshoppers themselves had reached a certain size, and by then I was ready to harvest my garlic, so I didn't lose any of my garlic crop to them. According to that same article, grasshoppers do not like to eat cucurbits, so that's my squash and my melons, or members of the nightshade family. And that's also consistent with what I've observed in my own garden, except for the garlic. Someone needs to tell the grasshoppers that they don't like potatoes, because the grasshoppers seem to be a little bit confused about that. Now, I also noticed that grasshoppers left my peas alone. Peas weren't mentioned in the phys.org article, but they were mentioned in the second article that I've linked to down in the description. So maybe peas are another safe grasshopper crop. If you've been wondering why grasshoppers seem more likely to eat some plants in your garden than other plants in your garden, maybe this fits that pattern that you're seeing as well. I do hope you let me know down in the comments if your observations match my observations and also what I found in the articles linked in the description. All right, so now that we know what crops are most likely to be impacted by grasshoppers, maybe you'd be interested in some tips for controlling grasshoppers without using pesticides. So I did find an article from the Northwest Center for Alternatives to Pesticides, linked in the description, that offers a lot of great advice for reducing grasshopper damage without resorting to spraying poisons all over the place. One of my favorite, but also one of the least effective ways to control grasshoppers in your garden is to attract their natural predators to come and eat some grasshoppers. And the reason this is the least effective method is because grasshopper populations have already evolved to overwhelm their predators. That's why we get these grasshopper plagues in the first place, because in a grasshopper plague, the predators are too full to eat more grasshoppers, and a few of them survive and reproduce. But it still does my heart good to see anything, eating the grasshoppers in my garden. Birds will munch grasshoppers. In fact, here in Utah, we have local folklore about the pilgrims being rescued their first year in the valley by a miraculous flock of seagulls that came and ate a plague of Mormon crickets that was eating all of their crops. I don't know how much of that story is true, but it's a great story. And I know that Mormon crickets aren't the same as grasshoppers, but it is an example of birds controlling pests. Yep, our state bird hangs out at the landfill. You probably don't want to attract seagulls to your garden, but you can attract other birds by placing feeders in the area. You don't want your feeders close enough that you're going to spend all of your time pulling up feeder weeds, but you do want to bring birds to your yard, and milkshakes aren't going to do it for you. Poultry will also do a really great job munching grasshoppers for you, chickens, maybe some Indian running ducks. But the problem with poultry is that it can also go after your crops, which defeats the purpose. They take much bigger bites than grasshoppers. So if you do want to use poultry for grasshopper control in your garden, my recommendation would be to have them be visitors to the garden rather than residents of the garden. Wasps, ground beetles, robber flies, and many parasitoid organisms are also going to be hard at work munching the grasshoppers in your garden. The article I've linked to also says that coyotes will eat grasshoppers, which is true because they're an omnivore, and maybe your dog will eat some grasshoppers as well. I don't recommend trying to attract coyotes to your garden. If you have the space and the gumption, you can plant a trap crop. A trap crop is something growing near or in your garden that your pests would rather eat. So good plants to include in your grasshopper trap crop would be any of the favorite foods I've already mentioned. Because grasshoppers are highly mobile, your trap crop isn't really going to work if it's just a planting here or there. If you want to control grasshopper intrusion into your garden with a trap crop, you're actually going to need to put your trap crop all around your garden. And that's why I'm saying maybe you need some space for that. Kind of an inside-out version of the trap crop idea is you could plant your less desirable crops like peppers and tomatoes and squash and stuff around the outsides of your garden, and your more desirable crops on the inside. If you use trap crops, it will only work if you combine that method with hand-picking grasshoppers. Warm hoppers are fast hoppers. So if you intend to hand-pick grasshoppers in your garden, I would recommend coming out in the coolest part of the day when the grasshoppers are a little bit sluggish. I'm not 10 anymore, so you're not going to catch me catching grasshoppers, except occasionally I'll catch a grasshopper and take it inside for my cats to play with, because it's actually a really fun cat toy. Once you've picked your grasshoppers, you've got options. Grasshoppers are considered a delicacy in some parts of the world. But if you don't want to eat them, maybe you could squish them or drop them in some soapy water. Some grasshoppers carry a parasite called the horsehair worm. If you get one of those, dropping them in soapy water is going to be a lot more thrilling than you might think. You can cover your crops to protect them from grasshoppers. Determined grasshoppers are actually able to chew through cloth or polyester row cover. So if you're having a really bad grasshopper plague, only a metal screen will keep them off your crops. But if your infestation is relatively mild, standard row cover should do the trick. The article from the Center for Alternatives to Pesticides also talks about a neem solution for controlling grasshoppers and Nosema locusta, which both of those are actually pesticides, so they're not technically going to be a pesticide alternative. And the thing with grasshoppers is that pesticide application is only really going to do you any good if it's applied early in their life cycle, in the spring, before we realize we have the problem. And that's especially going to be true with neem, which just kind of halts their development. It doesn't kill them outright. And Nosema locusta, which is a bacterium that infects the grasshoppers. The bacteria will reproduce in the digestive tract of the grasshoppers until they develop this massive bacterial infection that eventually kills them. And things only get more gruesome and awesome from there, because grasshoppers are cannibals. If a grasshopper encounters a dead grasshopper, it'll eat it. This cannibalism, though, is actually going to help us as gardeners, because the grasshopper is taking in the Nosema locusta infection along with the grasshopper tissue, and the infection will spread. It's like the Andromeda strain, but for grasshoppers. Nosema locustae is very specific to grasshoppers, so you can actually use it without worrying about doing any harm to your pollinators or the birds or other animals that come and visit your garden. The only problem I have with Nosema locustae is that its primary producer, the factory that makes no-low bait, burnt down. So everywhere is currently sold out of no-low bait, and it's really pricey when it's not sold out. There are some grasshopper trap designs that are recommended in the article, and that's all news to me. I haven't had a chance to try any grasshopper traps, so I'm not going to recommend any grasshopper traps. You can read the article and decide for yourself if that's something you want to try. I did see some recommendations for the use of aromatic herbs down in the articles I've linked to, and I am skeptical about the efficacy of aromatic herbs. I know that mint is aromatic and grasshoppers love to eat it. Basil is aromatic, and the only reason my basil's doing even remotely okay is that it's surrounded by tomatoes. An example of that reverse trap crop method I talked about. I've seen grasshoppers go after, well, they've stripped my thyme, and that's another aromatic in the same family. I'd take recommendations for aromatic herbs and aromatic oils with a grain of salt. They don't seem to dissuade grasshoppers very much, if they do at all. If you've tried any of these methods, or you know of some additional methods that might be helpful, I would love to hear your results in the comments or your recommendations in the comments. I'd like to thank all of my subscribers for helping build my channel viewership. I couldn't do it without you. I am almost monetized and it's all your fault. If you'd like to support my channel even more, there are channel membership options. You can click the join button down underneath this video, and there's a cute little video of me describing what you get as a channel member. As always, thank you for joining me here in my garden, and I hope you have a wonderful time in your own.